Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now Livestream series, where we bring you experts from the UW community talking about timely and important topics. As global leaders meet to make commitments to reduce emissions and combat climate change, energy prices are surging in many markets, most notably in Europe. While high prices and scarce supply may encourage conservation, they could also create a political backlash to greener energy. Do people trust the science behind climate change? What are the best approaches to reducing our dependence on fossil fuels? And are people willing to pay the costs of those changes? Will the transition path to renewables inadvertently shift power to autocratic governments who control substantial fossil fuel reserves? And what are the consequences for global alliances? We'll talk about these and other questions tonight with a panel of 3 UW experts at the intersection of climate, energy, and geopolitics. Mikhaila Calice has her master's in energy policy and analysis from the La Follette School for Public Affairs and is now a graduate student in the Department of Life Sciences and Communication here at UW-Madison. Mark Copelovitch is the director of the Center for European Studies, and Paul Wilson is the Granger Professor of Nuclear Engineering. So we have a terrific panel lined up with a range of expertise to cover what is a really important topic. Thank you all for taking time to be here. Our last show before Thanksgiving should be a real feast. All right, leading us off tonight, our first guest is Mikhaila Calice, as noted, has her MPA in Energy Policy and Analysis from the La Follette School for Public Affairs and is a graduate student in the Department of Life Sciences Communication. Her research interests include risk communication, public engagement with science, and community-level decision-making about controversial science issues. We have had a few of those, so I'm sure you've been busy, Michaela. Lots to research right now. With a background in energy policy, Michaela is especially interested in examining how communities, stakeholders, and policymakers perceive the energy transition and climate change more broadly in order to explore collaborative approaches to policymaking at local, state, and federal levels. Michaela, thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll let you kick the program off with your thoughts on this thorny issue.
Fantastic, Mike. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being with us this evening. We're really excited to talk about issues that we care about dearly and research quite a bit. As Mike said, I'm a PhD student here at UW-Madison in the Department of Life Sciences Communication. And so what that means is that I study controversial science issues and how the public understand them. Climate change and the energy transition are especially of interest to me because of my background. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about these issues from the science communication perspective. Next slide, please. So climate change, as we know, is a real issue. And the first thing that I'm going to do is kind of start us off with some public opinion polling data to give you a sense of where we're at when we think about climate change in the US and globally and what that means for the energy transition. So this research from the Yale, folks over at Yale doing great public opinion polling about climate change is a map of the US that shows that 72% of the United States public say that climate change is happening, and 60% think that it's human caused. There's been a recent poll that was done by a survey by the UN Development Program's People's Climate Vote. And this was a survey that surveyed 500,000 people around the world from 50 different countries. And in that survey, 64% of all surveyed believed that climate change is a global emergency. So this isn't just in the US, it's everywhere around the globe. And that makes sense because climate change has real impacts that we're already starting to see in our communities: environmental impacts, social impacts, economic impacts, huge health impacts. And that's exactly why we need to deal with it and why we're talking about it today. I especially like, if you know Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, I like how she frames it in her new book, Saving Us, because that's exactly what it's about. It's about the energy transition, and mitigating climate change is about us. It's about our children, our communities, our businesses, our economy. It's about setting ourselves up for success in the future. And the US public and the global community are here for it. Next slide. So what does this mean for how we deal with climate change? So this next, you can, yeah, awesome. There's a lot of public support for a range of policies to limit carbon output and reduce the effects of climate change. This all comes from Pew. As you can see, a lot of people favor putting trees to absorb carbon emissions, tax credits for businesses, restrictions on power plant carbon emissions, taxing corporations based on carbon emissions, or tougher fuel efficiency standards for cars. All over 70% of the American public support these measures, these policy measures. Next. And most Americans prioritize developing alternative energy sources over expanding fossil fuels. 79% of the country, of the United States population, is ready for the energy transition. And so it makes sense that we should start moving on this and really make sure that we are taking the steps necessary to make that a reality for our nation. Across the globe, there are a lot of countries, a lot of people who also believe that there are a lot of things that can be done. Conversations with COP26 happening right now to really figure out ways that we can manage these issues globally. 53% of all respondents of that of that UNDP survey I mentioned, they support the use of solar, wind, and renewable power. Other popular policies at the global scale include conservation, investing in green businesses and jobs, using more clean electric cars and transportation, building resiliency through infrastructure and disaster preparedness. So this is really something that people care about. People want us to do something about it. So we need to do something about it, right? Awesome. Next slide. To bring it back to the US again, these are some of the various policies that people are interested in. Just to reiterate this point, all that you see in blue here are support for major public investments in green solutions. And the sum of that support is shown in the blue text on the right. So you can see there's tons of support for renewable energy, smart grids, battery technology, electric buses, retrofitting buildings, underground transmission of electricity, electric vans and trucks. So there are a lot of ways that we can kind of meet these demands and actually move the energy transition forward that a lot of the public would be in support of. Next slide, please. One thing that we struggle with that I'm sure a lot of you know about is that perspectives are different across partisan lines a little bit. And this is not necessarily something that needs to be the case, right? Climate change is not an issue that only affects Democrats or only affects Republicans in the United States. It affects everybody. And the implications of it, as we start to see more and more of them, and as our communities start dealing with them more directly, hopefully it becomes less and less partisan, and we can kind of close that gap. You can do next slide. Awesome. So you see there are a lot of differences that we see across Democrats and Republicans about the government environmental action. And we see this playing out right now, right? With the infrastructure bill and kind of all the conversations going around that and all the things that weren't included in it, and why it's really important that we, figure out a way to pass something like the Build Back Better Act in order to get these really strong climate solutions through our government, because ultimately the public has said that they're interested in a lot of these things, but yet there's this kind of partisan divide that's keeping us from being able to actually push that forward in our country. Next slide, please. So when we think about controversial science issues in science communication in my field, and in a lot of the classes the science communication classes that we teach here at UW-Madison, we talk a lot about what factors influence how people perceive name your issue. So in this case, that's climate change. And one of them is how we process information and perceive risks of those issues. Another one is our individual identities, like our partisan identity. Who we trust as communicators is huge. So the people that are actually providing information to us, that really matters. Also, the socio-political and cultural context. This is a really big one because we don't just exist in a bubble. We exist in our communities in these broader contexts that if we don't consider when thinking about climate change and how we kind of address these needs, then we could really fall short of what the actions actually need to happen. And lastly, our information climate. And what I mean by this is like all the information that you receive. So your media environment, all of these factors, these broad factors, they all influence how we perceive climate change. And this is a lot of things to consider, right? These are all social things that we need to consider that amazing social scientists across the country and across the world are studying and working on. But I want to make this point that it's not just that we need a technology to kind of pull carbon out of the atmosphere and then we can solve climate change, right? Even if we have that technology, which is really fantastic, and I think a part of a diversified approach, really important, we also need to know, well, what community are we going to put that technology in and how are they going to, will they like it? Will they allow us to put that technology there? Or what kinds of technologies does one country need versus another because of the different socio-political contexts and their cultural norms? So there's a lot that we have to consider here. And that's what makes the climate change and the energy transition such a big issue with so many different experts working on it together in order to find these kind of cohesive solutions. So lastly, I want to leave you with just a few things to consider about when we talk about science communication and how to effectively communicate about controversial science issues. These are some of the things that have been heavily researched. Just providing people more information doesn't necessarily mean they're going to change their attitudes because we all use these kind of mental shortcuts to form our opinions and attitudes about issues like climate change, such as our partisan identity. It's really important that when we address people to try to get them to be interested in climate change or to try to change norms and behaviors, that we know who we're talking to. A community in northern Wisconsin might have very different needs and opinions and desires than a community in maybe Chicago or another urban area. How we frame climate change is also really important. So thinking about it in terms of, economic benefits versus social benefits, or thinking about it in terms of equity and justice, or even thinking about it in terms of like being positive when we talk about climate change or versus being very doom and gloom. The next thing is that trust is super essential and it can be lost. And people really do care about who's providing the messages to them. And so we want to make sure that we don't do things that will lose trust. And part of that is making sure that we are being transparent and also not saying that there's like this doom and gloom future in 12 years, right? Giving a specific number about how long we have left to deal with climate change can get a little bit sticky because once that 12 years comes along, if people don't see that future that they envisioned when you gave them that information, they might lose trust in you as a messenger. And lastly, a really important point that I know that we'll probably talk about more today is that climate change and energy are really justice and equity issues because they affect people disproportionately in certain communities, especially in Black and Brown communities around the globe and in the United States. And so our efforts must be centered in considering justice and equity in the energy transition. Thank you all so much. You can reach me at Twitter and by email. I look forward to an awesome conversation.
Well, thank you, Michaela. That was a great overview of people's attitudes and also how to think about how they're formed and how we can shape them through communication. Really helpful to set the stage for tonight.
Thank you, Mike.
Our next guest is Paul Wilson, and Paul is the Granger Professor of Nuclear Engineering and chair of UW-Madison's Department of Engineering Physics. His research interests focus on developing improved tools for modeling complex nuclear energy systems with applications in radiation shielding, nuclear waste management, nuclear non-proliferation, and energy policy. In addition to his research and teaching, he served in several advisory and consultant roles, including as a member of the U.S. Department of Energy's Generation 4 Technology Roadmap Committee. He was also the founding president of the North American Young Generation in Nuclear, an organization created to provide unique opportunities to young professionals in all fields of nuclear science and technology. Paul, it is great to have a Granger professor on the show, and especially you. So take it away and tell us what your thoughts are about the energy situation.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I'm glad to be here and glad to talk a little bit about energy. I'm thinking also about the fact you mentioned the NAYGN, that we're in the middle of COP26, and one of the things I got my start in was attending some of the COP climate change meetings to talk about nuclear energy and the role it has to play. And so hopefully we'll arrive at that point in my discussion today. I didn't put any slides together. I just thought we'd sort of talk through some of the history and where we've arrived and what are the issues related to energy, and particularly with respect to climate. We know for millennia that access to energy has been an economic driver. Even before the Industrial Revolution, humans were using water, wind, and sun, as well as manual labor and animal power. But over time, we've realized that not all energy is created equally. During the Industrial Revolution, we learned how to harness the very highly concentrated energy of coal, oil, and ultimately natural gas. And essentially, these are all concentrated solar power, converted first into biomass and then stored underground for millions of years. This led to the rapid expansion of innovation and economic growth, but as Michaela has just described, has come with really severe consequences. First, in air pollution and acid rain that were big issues in this country 40 years ago, but most recently in their impact on the climate. Then during World War II, we learned how to harness the atom, first for violence, but then for generating clean commercial energy. And pound per pound, nuclear fission is 1 million times more concentrated than fossil fuels. And throughout all of this history, we've relied on technological advances that allow us to use each of these sources better and better, at times cleaner, at times cheaper, and sometimes both. And in addition to massive reductions in air pollution from fossil fuels, those kinds of innovations have also allowed us to reconsider the wind and sun in the last few decades. If we fast forward to today, we have many choices of technologies to explore for meeting our energy needs, and they're not all equal. And it's important to consider not just the quantity of energy we have access to and the capacity that we've built, but also the quality. What are the characteristics and the qualities that make energy different for us to be able to use in our society? And the key characteristic of interest tonight, of course, is how clean the energy is. Michaela has reminded us how important it is to move away from fossil fuels, not just for electricity, but other direct uses in the transportation sector, in the industrial sector, and across our economy. Another important metric, of course, is reliability. Our modern society relies on guaranteed access to electricity to meet so many of our needs. When we go to the wall and turn the switch on, we expect it to be there. Certainly that's true in our homes, but we can manage to have a little bit of an interruption. But when we think about places like hospitals, factories, other data centers, it's really important that we have guaranteed access to electricity. Wind and solar energy are not great on this metric, of course, and they require storage technologies to help provide this secure access. And those storage technologies, fortunately, are getting cheaper and helping us explore wind and solar and deeper roles for them in our energy system. Another important metric, another quality measure, is how concentrated the energy is. We engineers refer to this as entropy. This is a measure of how effectively we can convert one form of energy to another form of energy without losing access to it, without throwing some away. Gasoline has been an important fuel, for example, because we can carry enough of it with us for hundreds of miles of travel. Replacing that with batteries or hydrogen has been challenging, but we're making progress and we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel of being able to use alternate sources of energy for transportation. When we look at the electricity grid, wind and solar energy are naturally diffuse, and it requires large amounts of land area or ocean area, if you're thinking of offshore wind, to provide meaningful quantities of electricity. And so that diffuse nature creates a lot of challenges, first technologically, but then socially and politically when we look at siting and how we choose to use our land and what's important to us for different uses. Because of all of these different qualities, research is showing time and again that a balanced mix of these different technologies is very important to create an effective, reliable, and economic electricity grid that will meet all of our needs in the future. One of my energy colleagues, a professor named Jesse Jenkins, has suggested that we think of this like an elite sports team. The championship Milwaukee Bucks need a healthy balance of different positions to be a successful team. Some power forwards, some shooting guards, and even some players to come off the bench when the time is needed. There's three main categories we can think of in this respect. One of them is something we can call fuel-saving technologies. Wind and solar are great examples of these, and they allow us to have access to electricity without consuming fuels that might have limited supply or other reasons we don't want to use them all the time. Another category are fast switching technologies. These are necessary because unlike many of the economic markets and the commodities that we trade, electricity needs to be in perfect balance of supply and demand at every moment. When you turn the lights on in your home, that new electricity must be coming from somewhere. And so we need technologies that can help bridge the gaps as the other technologies are ramping up and ramping down for various reasons. And a final category, broadly speaking, are technologies we can refer to as firm low carbon sources. The fact that they're firm is important. That terminology means that we can turn them on and off whenever we need them, and we can rely on them to be able to come on when we need them and turn off when we don't need them. Geothermal power is a good example. Possibly fossil fuels with carbon capture, although there's still a lot to be understood about whether that can really sort of make more energy than it consumes. And finally, nuclear energy is an important firm low carbon source. As we drive to lower and lower carbon in our energy systems, finding that right balance becomes even more important. At this point in time, with the system we have, we've got a lot of choices and we can move between them. But as we try and crank down on the amount of carbon we're generating and getting to zero, that balance is really important. And when we look at firm low carbon, nuclear energy is really the only technology that's ready today to be deployed to meet this need. And so the faster we try and reach that low carbon, the more it really is necessary to rely on it as a balanced part of this mix. And I think it's important to note that nuclear energy is currently undergoing a lot of dramatic change from what we all may be used to. Reactors are getting smaller by factors of 50 or 100, allowing us to imagine reactors that can be deployed for single communities or single data centers or factories, and opening the door to more community control and community choice of where nuclear is being used and which communities are happy with it and what benefits it may give. And there's also growing interest in the role of nuclear energy to supply other energy products, including hydrogen and direct heat for industrial processes or water desalination. Nuclear energy supplies today 50% of the low carbon electricity in the United States, and provides much larger fractions in places like France, the province of Ontario, Sweden, and so on. And it's been the dominant source of low carbon electricity in the United States for decades. Nuclear energy, if I was having this conversation 5 or 6 years ago, nuclear energy was providing over 2/3 of the low carbon electricity, with most of the rest coming from hydro. Massive expansion of wind and solar have helped take that up and have reduced the share of nuclear electricity, but we still have a large quantity being produced. So the takeaway I think that's important here is that while there's a lot of interest in really exploring wind and solar energy with related storage technologies, the ability to store enough electricity to make it through all the variations of when wind and solar are available results in energy systems that are massively overbuilt and require massive quantities of land and other materials, and don't necessarily make the most effective electricity system when you're done. And so finding that right balance and the role for nuclear energy being an important part of that balance is an important part of designing our electricity systems of the future. So with that, I'll happily pass it on to Mark, and we'll have questions later. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for those thoughts, Paul. And I guess I'll ask you what, when we come back, what you think the Pew survey participants would say about increased use of nuclear. Maybe you're aware of some studies on that. Our final guest tonight is Mark Copelovitch. He's a professor of political science and public affairs in the Robert M. La Follette School of Public Affairs. Mark is also the director of the Center for European Studies and an affiliate of the Center for German and European Studies and the Jean Monnet European Center of Excellence. He specializes in international political economics and international trade organizations. with a focus on the politics of international trade, finance, and the International Monetary Fund and European integration. He's the author of The International Monetary Fund in the Global Economy, Banks, Bonds, and Bailouts. And Mark, I know you will tell us a bit about how energy and money flows are linked around the world and how that might shape all the change that we see ahead as we rely on different energy sources. Thank you, Mark.
Great. Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here. And thanks to Michaela and to Paul for leading us off. So as Mike mentioned, I'm a political scientist. I focus on the politics of international trade and finance, international organizations and cooperation. I am not an expert in climate and energy like Michaela and Paul are. But what I thought I would do and what I could speak about is the international and also domestic politics of climate and energy, and focus in particular on the political constraints and the economic constraints that the three largest players, both economically and politically, in world affairs face in meeting energy and climate challenges. So those are the United States, the European Union, and China. And so when I think about this, Mike asked me to talk about geopolitics, but I think about this as an economic issue, as a financial issue, also as much of an issue about geopolitics as about domestic politics, right? And I think thinking about who faces the hardest political and economic constraints is useful because it shifts a little bit some of the political debate we have here in the United States about what we can afford, what we can do, how we're positioned relative to China in particular. And so if you think about the constraints the U.S. faces, the big point I want to make is that the constraints we face in dealing with energy and climate are almost exclusively domestic and almost exclusively political. What I'm going to talk about and hopefully convince you over the next few minutes is the United States monetary and financial dominance in the world economy actually gives us unparalleled resources to meet these challenges. We can pretty much afford to do whatever we need, right? The options Paul talked about, the various policies that Michaela talked about, relative to the EU, relative to China, we are much more financially and economically free to do whatever we want. The barriers are about politically, is there support for that? The other thing I would point out about the United States, and I'll show you this in a few minutes, is that we are far less dependent for our energy, oil imports in particular, on authoritarian regimes and countries that we are not closely allied with geopolitically than either the EU or China, right? And that puts us politically in a much better position relative to the other two, if you will, great powers in the international system for how we meet these challenges. If we shift over to the European Union, on that point, the big constraint and problem facing the EU is that they are extremely dependent on natural gas imports from Russia for their energy needs. And that creates both economic risks, but also potentially political disincentives, right? The EU is dealing with lots of challenges, one of which is a Russia on its eastern border that is encroaching on a potential new member state, Ukraine. Right? Russia is occupying the eastern part of Ukraine and Crimea. And so there are a lot of political tensions as the EU thinks about moving towards alternative energy or potentially moving away from energy trade with Russia. That's not just an economic issue, but it also becomes a security and geopolitical issue. The other thing with the EU, and maybe this will come up a little more in Q&A as well, if we think about the consequences of climate change and energy shortages in terms of economic instability, possibly refugees and migration over time, the EU is probably the actor of these three that is most exposed to climate-related migration. You can almost think about, a refugee crisis 2.0 that would be climate or energy related at some point in the future, not related to civil wars in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan. And the other challenge the EU is wrestling with is there's a lot going on in Europe right now, right? It's been a decade of crisis. We're looking at a decade of more crises. So between the European financial crisis that started in 2010 and is in some ways still going on, the challenge of Brexit the UK leaving the European Union, the rise of authoritarian countries within the midst of the EU, authoritarian governments in Poland and Hungary. So there's a lot of challenges that Europe faces in its own domestic politics. And a key challenge for the EU is finding the bandwidth, right, to deal with energy and climate on top of all of these other crises. When we turn to China, I think a key point that I would make, and again, this is maybe a little bit contra what one sees often in the media or hears in the US political debate, is China's challenges are much more severe than the United States. And their economic and political model that they have used to great success for development and growth over the last 30 years faces a lot of questions about whether it's still sustainable in the medium to long term. The other thing with China, as again, I'll show you in a minute, is that China is the most vulnerable of these three great powers to trade and fossil fuel dependence on other authoritarian regimes. So if we're thinking about which actor, the US versus the EU versus China, has partners, right, that are rich countries, that are democratic countries that may be willing to cooperate with it in meeting these challenges, China is much more isolated than both the US and the EU. Next slide, please. So I'm going to run through fairly quickly a few charts and graphs to kind of illustrate this, some of these points. So on the point of the US having unparalleled resources, this is a chart of the world's global reserve currencies. And it's part of a broader point that I think is really important to drive home, which is the US's financial dominance in the global economy. So you'll see that nearly 2/3 of the world's foreign exchange reserves are dollars. About 20% are euros, and then there's a bunch of smaller reserve currencies, of which the Chinese renminbi is now one, but it's only 2% of global reserves. Basically, the world economy runs on dollars, right? And if you think about our ability to pay for, borrow, invest, spend to meet climate and energy challenges, that gives us an enormous advantage relative to both the EU and to China. Next slide, please. And this is another way to look at this. These are a couple of my favorite charts from Helene Ray, an economist who writes about international money and finance. These are overall world exports and overall global portfolio investment. And it gives you a sense of the relative size of the US versus China versus the European Union in the world economy, right? And you'll see when we look at trade and exports on the left, you see the US and China are basically the same size. Right? You've probably heard a lot in the news about how China is catching up to the United States, is now basically 1A or 1B if we are 1A, and who is the global economic hegemon. That's true on trade. But if you look over on the right on investment, you see how much bigger the US's advantage is. Right? We really are the center of the world financial economy. In both stocks and flows, you'll see China is there below the US. It's a very small circle. Right. China has very small and underdeveloped private domestic financial markets, and very little of global capital flows actually takes place in dollars, takes place in renminbi, takes place in dollars, it takes place in euros. So when you think about the slide I just showed you and this one, the US really has an unparalleled financial advantage to deal with climate and energy challenges. Next slide, please. And that then gets at what is really a political issue. And Michaela talked about some of this, of what can we as the United States afford, right? A lot of the policy and political narrative these days in the US is about debt and inflation. If you look at the top chart here, the blue line, you see a lot of what we hear is debt to GDP. Is overall debt of the US government is now at a level that it hasn't been since just after World War II, right? And that is true. But if you look at the other line in the right axis, you see that actually borrowing costs are so low right now. And there's so much money moving around in the international financial system, and particularly into dollars, that the US's interest payments are actually smaller than they've been in decades. And if you look at the bottom chart, this is, as of yesterday, what the borrowing costs are for the US in terms of issuing long-term debt. And this is a real interest rate. So it's the nominal interest rate minus inflation. And basically what you see is that international investors are willing to give us their money for 3 decades in exchange for negative real interest rates. right? So the debate about what we can afford, right, really is, it depends on how you look at it, right? On the one hand, debt is very high relative to history. On the other hand, the US is so dominant in international finance, and the available capital for us to borrow and invest in clean energy solutions and addressing climate change, we're at a point where we have more freedom to do that than we've had in decades. Next slide, please. And when you look then at what we pay to borrow versus what China in particular pays to borrow, you see again that we have a big advantage and China faces more hard constraints. So these are nominal yields on 10-year government bonds, right? So you look at this over time and you see a couple things. One is for the rich democratic countries of the world, Japan, the US, the European countries, borrowing costs are extremely low and they're declining over time. You look at China, it costs China a lot more to borrow, right? Their 10-year bonds, they need to pay 4% interest. We are actually paying almost 0% nominal interest and negative real interest. So that means that China actually has to pay more to borrow and invest and fund climate and energy solutions. And they face tighter fiscal constraints in the medium to long term than we do. Next slide, please. The other issue that China is really struggling with is China has been fueling its export-led growth development model by allowing a private credit boom to happen in the economy for the better part of 3 decades now. Right? You see the last 20 years or so here. You see both in private credit growth percent per year, which is the top chart, as well as total private credit as a share of gross domestic product in the bottom chart. The Chinese economy is incredibly leveraged in a way that the US economy is not. And so again, if you put these things together, right, the monetary and financial advantages of the US put us in a much more advantageous position to be able to fund and invest in the medium to long term in climate and energy solutions. It's possible China can keep this level of credit growth going. But as you might have heard from the news about the real estate bubble in China, the Evergrande collapse, there are a lot of concerns now that China is going to face a banking and real estate and financial crisis in the next 10 to 20 years, if not sooner. And that would further place serious constraints on their ability to address climate and energy solutions. Next slide. Now, the other thing I would like to talk about just for a couple minutes is to think about who these 3 great powers depend on for energy. Who are their partners? Who are they exposed to and vulnerable to? This is one way to think about it. So this is US monthly oil imports by country of origin. And I think the big takeaway is relative to history, especially if you think about the oil shocks of the 1970s or how dependent we were on oil from Saudi Arabia and OPEC in the 1980s and 1990s, the US is a lot more energy independent. Right, not only because of alternative energy sources, as Paul talked about, but because most of our oil imports now come from the democratic neighbors that either we are close military and geopolitical allies with, like our NATO ally Canada to the north, or that we have free trade agreements with Mexico. Right, so we have NAFTA or the USMCA, the NAFTA supplement now, replacement. We are far less dependent on authoritarian countries and countries from the Middle East for oil imports than we were decades ago. And that's a very different situation than China and the EU. Next slide. So you see with China, right, this is the same chart for China. You see that with the exception of other non-OPEC and Brazil, which are some of those Western democratic countries, you see China is enormously dependent on Russia, OPEC, Saudi Arabia for its energy needs. China's energy needs are growing vastly faster even than ours are. And it is still heavily coal dependent. So its ability to turn to alternative energy sources is far less than ours. And again, if you place the financial constraints China faces with this dependence on a set of countries that it is not necessarily as close to geopolitically, or maybe you're not as likely partners in clean energy and addressing climate change, it puts China in a more vulnerable position relative to the US. Next slide. And finally, if we turn to the EU, you see similar concerns, right? I mentioned the EU's vulnerability to Russia earlier, this is a couple charts that I came across on Twitter this week. You see right now that Russia actually has turned off gas flows to Germany via the pipeline that goes through Poland. And that is of real concern, not only because winter is coming in Europe, but it raises concerns about the EU's ability to fund its energy needs at affordable prices for the foreseeable future, right? So the EU is less dependent on some of the countries that China is dependent on for oil imports, but it's heavily dependent on Russia for natural gas imports. And that places it in the same position of geopolitical vulnerability, which is more akin to what China faces than what the United States faces. And last slide, please. So finally, the last thing I'd like to do is just kind of throw out some questions, and maybe these will prompt some discussion in the Q&A about what we might see going forward in terms of the international and domestic politics of climate and energy. So one is whether some of the institutions we have, the big international organizations we have in trade and finance, might start to more productively tackle climate and energy, right? So Paul mentioned the COP conference, right? The Paris Agreement is a voluntary agreement without binding enforcement mechanisms. One way to think about making global progress on climate and energy is to think about whether or not the institutions that do have harder enforcement mechanisms, like the World Trade Organization, some of our other trade agreements, or like the IMF and the World Bank, the international financial institutions that engage in conditional lending to countries, whether those institutions might start to make climate and energy commitments prerequisites, right, for participation or recipients of financial aid. I'll skip actually down to the bottom one. Another big question, which I don't have a lot of great insights into, but is something that a lot of international relations scholars are talking about, is whether climate change and energy shortages might actually become fuel for future territorial conflict. Right? One of the things we've actually seen in the international system since World War II is a decline over time in war, particularly wars between states or interstate wars. And there are a lot of scholars in international relations now wondering whether climate change might lead to more territorial conflict. And that's something that certainly we might think about and worry about, particularly with a rising China advancing and having possible territorial designs on Taiwan and elsewhere. The last thing I would mention is domestic politics, right? So Michaela started us off, right? And I think one of the things she hit on is the really big barriers to doing something serious in the US, as well as in the EU and in China, doing something serious about climate and energy are domestic politics, right? And you can think about climate and energy posing threats to Chinese regime stability, to European integration, driving further wedges in American public opinion and the polarization that we're facing in US politics right now, as well as rising prices and climate and energy challenges, possibly exacerbating the tensions we've seen in the last decade, the nationalist and populist backlash against trade and globalization, right? So I think the thing that I would leave us with in that vein in terms of US politics is that most of the major policy initiatives we've seen in the last 100 years in the United States, if you think about the New Deal, if you think about the Marshall Plan, US participation in institutions like NATO, the IMF, and the World Bank, those things happened in the wake of and in the face of major crises where politicians and presidents in particular made them national security issues, right? And so one way to think about how might we move forward on climate and energy is US presidents, the current administration and future administrations, linking that to the debate about how we deal with rising China and debates about the future of American hegemony. That has positive sides and potential negative sides. But I think that linking of the economic security to national security to climate and energy issues is something that's crucial if we're going to make major progress in the years ahead. So I'll stop there and I look forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. What a great capstone. I think we hit everything: climate, energy, and geopolitics. You guys you're rule followers. I don't expect that with faculty or graduate students generally. So thank you. Great content tonight. You know, and I guess fighting an invisible enemy like this is maybe even more difficult, you know, as you point out, Mark. Yeah. How do you mobilize people? And Michaela, you talked a lot about communication, and and people's attitudes. And, one of the things that was coming up in the chat is, what do we know about what American households are actually willing to pay to make progress on this? People can say they're in favor of things, but I've become concerned that as a country, we may not be willing to really pay the costs that maybe some previous generations did for what we enjoy today in this country. Do you have thoughts about that? And do we survey people on, what they personally are willing to contribute?
I'm happy to
go ahead
here and start. I think that, a message here that resonates with me, at least, is that the cost of not doing something is much higher, right? And we really need to think about what it really will cost in worst case scenarios, but not even that far worst case scenarios. The effects of climate change and not doing something about this now is going to be expensive. And so we're really investing in our future and investing in not that long term of a future. So I agree that cost is something that people really care about, though, and it's something that resonates really well with people. And so how can we maybe juxtapose the cost of a program with also the benefits, the economic benefits of that program? How can bringing new energy technologies to a community really support the economy of that local community? And can we run cost benefit analyses at that community level to try to create some support for new technologies or for local state policies that are trying to do this work? It is harder at that kind of federal level when you're trying to get everyone on board with something, when there are all these like really contextual factors that matter at the community level. But I think that cost doesn't have to be a barrier. It can also be a way, if we reframe it, to talk about the positive economic benefits of so much of what is being discussed in terms of the energy transition, because there are a lot of benefits here.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point of thinking about framing this. The political framing of this has to do with trade-offs of the cost now versus the cost in the future, but also the relative benefits, right? So, a little of what I talked about with the way we think about U.S. borrowing and debt, the household analogy that the government is like a household and it should tighten its belt in tough times and things. It's a heuristic or framework that people use, but that U.S. financial dominance and our ability to borrow and fund things, if we can invest in things over 30 years and pay negative real interest, and those things have real economic returns of 5 to 10%, they create a bunch of jobs and new export industries, right? The overall cost of financing these things over a 10, 20, 30-year period is really, really low. But that's not how the political debate, the political debate is very short term about what am I going to pay this year versus when am I going to see the benefits? And, I don't know that anybody has a good answer for that, but I think, as Michaela mentioned, a lot of this is how you frame the issue. And thinking about this as public works, public investment, and things that will pay for themselves over time. I think that's really important. And again, that's why the U.S. is in a much better position, because we have more freedom to borrow and invest especially than China does.
And I just want to add, Michaela brought it up earlier, but I think there's an equity framing here that we have to be very cognizant of as well. I mean, as Michaela said, there's going to be a cost of doing nothing, but those costs are going to be most likely borne by the people with the least resources. And the people with the most resources are going to be able to mitigate how they feel the impacts of climate change and how they feel the impacts of these changes. And so, in the structures, as you said, Mike, there's this political will question of, are we willing to do something about it? And it's probably a whole different UW Now episode to talk about just that, because I think climate change is just one of the facets where, we see these equity issues coming up as a challenge in making progress in these big societal questions.
Yeah, those are all great points. Don't pin it all on the UW Now, okay? I mean, we'll work on it, but that's a tall order to fill. But these are justice and equity issues. And it does involve, investment that might pay future benefits. But last time I looked at studies of voting, people want current benefits and they're willing to pay future costs. and that seems to be the way politics works today. And, Michaela, you alluded to people in northern Wisconsin. It's hard to get their attention about global warming. They are not experiencing, I think, in their day-to-day life, they are not seeing the costs right now. And so, funding something across the board for everyone to protect people, a smaller set of people who may be more exposed at the moment, is politically just very challenging. And I think that is an important subject to take up in the future. We did have a question that I'd like to take about how would you account, the question from Michael Benninger is, how do you account for the failure of wind and solar energy sources this past winter in Texas, which caused blackouts and death? And are those sources reliable? And Paul, I think you were going to take that.
Sure. I mean, I think it's really important to understand where the fault lies and where we point the fingers in a situation like this. It was a tragic event that happened in Texas. Not just the death, the economic impacts that have rippled throughout the country, in fact. But it's not fair, and I think the energy experts agree that wind and solar energy are not at fault for what happened in Texas in February. When we designed the energy system, I talked about intermittency and reliability, but one of the things we designed the energy system for is their ability to predict. And in Texas, they have a pretty good ability to predict how much wind and solar energy is going to be available a day ahead, a couple of days ahead. And so they design a system that allows them to mitigate that. And so what happened in February in Texas was a failure of natural gas to be available when it was promising to be available. The wind and solar energy were not producing large fractions of their capacity, but that was predicted and known long in advance. And the natural gas was the technology that they were relying on to fill that gap and provide them with reliable electricity, knowing that the wind and solar energy would not be available. And the failure of being able to deliver natural gas is really at the root cause of that blackout. I will, in full disclosure, there are 4 nuclear reactors in Texas, and one of those reactors went down because of the cold as well. And so nuclear, it was a smaller fraction of the total. I can't say that it was the main culprit, but it had its own issues as well.
I also, I think the Texas episode gets at what we were just talking about in terms of short-term versus long-term investments. That episode and other episodes are failures of 5 decades of underinvestment in infrastructure in the United States, right? And so, I think part of the political debate, Mike, you mentioned, people in northern Wisconsin aren't experiencing the effects of climate change, but more and more people are experiencing the effects of climate change in extreme weather events, right? Episodes like happened in Texas. And, I think that is part of why the public support broadly is at the level Michaela showed us, right? Of, 70, 75, 80, 85%, depending on what thing we're talking about. Those numbers are much higher than they were 20 years ago. And it is because more and more people are seeing things, right? The people are reading articles about how Miami and New Orleans are going to be half underwater in 15 or 20 years. And, I think the political debate is shifting a little bit in that way. The question is whether those events can mobilize public opinion and then mobilize politicians to move forward on the longer term investments, because those things are only going to get worse. Right. And the borrowing costs that are so low now are probably going to be higher in the future. And so figuring out how to take advantage of investment now that is going to pay off and mitigate those types of things 10, 20, 30 years from now is key. Again, it's politically thorny, but I think it's really urgent to do.
I want to piggyback off of something that Mark said too, in relation to what happened in Texas is, we wouldn't even be talking about renewables as influencing or being the cause of what happened in Texas if there weren't some really key messengers in the media and in politics that were kind of pushing that message. I'm pretty sure that came up originally on conservative talk shows. Tucker Carlson, I remember talking about that it was wind's fault, and then therefore green energy, it means a less reliable power grid, he claimed. And then you had the governor of Texas blaming wind for the power outages, and then other Republican leaders in the Senate and the House of Representatives from Texas that were kind of pigging back on that message and making it a polarized issue of fossil fuels versus renewables, when it didn't need to be about that at all in the first place. It was a really technical issue, but it had, like, as Paul explained, reasons for what happened. And I think that the media and how politicians kind of ran with a certain message really did influence people's opinion, and likely impacted their trust in those institutions to provide them reliable power, which is a huge problem.
Yeah, it's certainly true that communication is really at a premium on these issues. And it's hard to feel confident about the willingness to invest in combating climate change when, as you note, Mark, we're not even investing in our own energy grids. We can't get people to make that investment for themselves. And somehow we have to change that dynamic. I want to go to a question from Steve Goldstein, who wonders, how might we overcome current opinions that nuclear is bad without differentiating among nuclear energy, the waste, the weapons? And can it really be a significant part of the energy mix in the future? Is it safe? Jonathan Patz had similar questions. What are the three things that are different about nuclear since Chernobyl? Because I guess that was probably the buzzkill for nuclear energy. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl.
Yeah, perhaps Fukushima was the real buzzkill for energy. True. More recently as well.
Okay.
So I think that the key technology change that I think a lot of the nuclear energy community is really hopeful for is the advent of these much smaller reactors, and it brings with it some real fundamental differences in a few dimensions. One of them is that the capital outlay to build a reactor will be much smaller, and that's sort of the simple economic one. Another important one is that the emergency response needs to be much smaller. And in fact, the first of these reactor concepts that's being licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has successfully argued that they don't need to have an emergency planning zone at all. That the radiation, in the event of the worst case in their situation, there won't be any radiation released off-site, and nobody needs to worry about having to evacuate and things like that. And the final one is that nuclear is finally being delivered at a scale where communities can imagine having an impact. And Michaela and I are working on a project together to look at how communities might be more involved in their energy decisions in the future. In the United States, we've come out over a very slow period of market restructuring in the last couple of decades into a place where we've gone from very large centralized utilities basically making all the decisions for consumers with the intervention of public utility and public service commissions, but individual consumers really feel removed from the decisions they're making about their energy choices. And as we go forward and we look at wind energy, solar energy, micronuclear, other smaller scale energy sources, that creates a very different social dynamic, and it allows equity issues, sovereignty issues, reliability issues to be tackled at a place where we can bring communities together to understand how they want to exhibit those values. And I think that nuclear is finally able to play in that same discussion. We've had a lot of interest in distributed generation for a couple of decades, but nuclear was always sort of the antithesis of distributed generation. And so small nuclear reactors allow it to be in a different kind of conversation.
Yeah, I would also add sort of separately on, since we were talking about the media ecosystem a few minutes ago, that it's been hard, I think, for those sorts of important issues that Paul is talking about to get oxygen when what is in the news about nuclear things is Iran and North Korea, right? And you can start to see how issues politically linked together. If there was more progress on the nuclear weapons side of American foreign policy having to do with proliferation, right, that might create more domestic political space to have these discussions on nuclear as an energy option. And we haven't been there the last 5 years or so.
I think it'll be really interesting to see also when the nuclear technology can get into our communities. And there's some really awesome people, Paul is one of them, that are trying to transform how we think about, bringing technologies into communities by really involving the communities in that process and thinking about what communities want when citing new nuclear technology, asking communities before trying to bring those technologies to them, whether or not they'd be willing to have small modular reactors in their community. And then one of the things that came out of the energy of this project that Paul mentioned, we had a workshop with community energy leaders from across Wisconsin come and talk about energy independence and decision-making of energy management. And one of the things that came out of that is a lot of enthusiasm around micronuclear and small modular reactors, but this kind of desire that there be some proof that it works, and having there be pilot programs that are funded to really show in action, to bring it to communities and have people be more familiar with the technologies, so that their only associations aren't just kind of these really scary, uncertain disasters from the past, but are actually, a beautiful technology that's like in their neighborhood that they can go to, that's safe, that's familiar, and creating these opportunities to bring the technologies to people so that they can become familiar with them, I think will really go a long way in shifting that public opinion, and having news coverage about that should hopefully help. So I'm very hopeful on the nuclear front here.
Paul, have you thought about calling it the nuclear idea? You take it, it might restore people's, confidence in science, which does seem to be shaken, frankly, at the moment. But Mark, I know we're past 8 o'clock. You said you could stay. I hope you could stay with us for a minute yet. Mark, Eric Johnson wonders, does the U.S. really still today have a monetary and financial dominance in the global economy?
Yes, and it's not the narrative that you hear, right? The narrative you hear is one of declining American hegemony. American hegemony has been declining for as long as I've been in academic institutions.
Yeah.
So, but I think it's hard to get through the media coverage of rising China and the new Cold War. China is a very large middle-income country that is important in trade.
Lower middle
and geopolitically important. But in terms of importance in the international monetary and financial system, very small, right? And dollar dominance and the size of U.S. financial markets relative to other countries actually has increased in the last two financial crises that we've now had since 2008. And, the dollar is more powerful than it has been at any time since the 1970s. And there are no clear replacements, right? Paul's going to laugh because he's heard me give this speech before, but the euro is the only viable challenger, and until the euro has the political and fiscal integration that we have in the United States, it's not going to replace the dollar. And China, in order to challenge the U.S. monetarily and financially, would effectively have to do all the things it's not doing to keep its export-led growth model going as long as possible. It would have to get rid of capital controls. It would have to develop deep private financial markets. It would have to privatize its state-owned banks. It would have to run large current account deficits instead of current account surpluses. And politically, Xi Jinping and the Chinese government wants to do none of those things, right? So for the foreseeable future, there's no replacement. And you often hear Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. They're also not replacement for the dollar. So, but that's hard to kind of get through what you hear in media discussions and political discussions about debt and American decline and the rise of China. And that I think if we could break through that, it would open up, along with a lot of the technological and public opinion side of things, it would open up space to have political discussions about those long-term investments. right? But we're not there, and I'm not exactly sure how we get there. But the U.S. does have, relative to all of the major competitors, unparalleled fiscal and financial space to move. We just have to decide that we're going to do it. And that again,
I think we've been here before. You know, I came of age as an economist when everything written about the U.S. economy was that Germany and Japan were going to dislodge us as the next economic powers. And when is the last time anybody said that? You know, there's an enormous capacity for innovation in the U.S. because of our economic institutions. And, you know, accidents of history have put us in a great position in the financial system as well. But
and our universities.
And our universities. So far, we have not squandered that, but sometimes it seems like we're trying awfully hard.
Yeah. But it does give me some hope for optimism. And these are the Michaela and Paul talking about, you know, the technologies that we now have and the types of innovations that are happening, along with the economic resources to do it. It's a different situation than other countries that don't have those things, right? The politics are hard, but to have the technology and to have the economic resources to do it is actually cause for optimism.
Well, if you can give people the macro confidence and we can send Paul out with the nuclear idea and Michaela communicates about all this, then we'll have something going.
It's a dream team.
Yes. I had no idea we had, by the way, an integrated dream team on this show. But
Surprise.
I thank you all for taking time out of your Tuesday night. I would love to do this again sometime. You've been a terrific panel, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
A lot of fun.
Well, that concludes our pre-Thanksgiving feast of ideas. I look forward to seeing you again on Tuesday, December 7th. We will have another exciting program, and hopefully by then, on the field, on the court, on the ice, the Badgers will have won many more games by then, and we'll have a lot of happy Wisconsin fans. Thanks for joining us. See you again soon, and on Wisconsin.
You can try, but you'll never stop a Badger, because we Badgers are born with curious minds and endless heart. When we see a curve in the road, we speed up. When there are mask shortages for first responders, we make our own supply chain. When there's a world on pause, we sharpen our claws. Through thunder, fire, and pandemics, we'll keep going. Because after all, you can't stop a Badger.